A long journey starts with one small infant step, and those who must climb Mount Everest, the early beginnings are stumbles and falls of a little baby. A giant vat vriksh, which must be shelter and home to many creatures, earthly and unearthly, starts with a little seed buried under the depths of darkness. This is the human start. Aurobindo describes very beautifully in Savitri. A long, dim preparation is man's life, a circle of toil and hope, of war and peace, tracked by life on matter's obscure ground. His climb to a height no feet ever has trod. He seeks through a penumbra shot with flame. Search for a reality half guessed, ever missed. Cult of an ideal never made real here. How beautifully said. And then what happens? A giant point is reached at last, when out of nature's borderlines we must escape into supernature's arc of living light. So this is the whole human journey. And when we read Aurobindo, one of the first difficulties that we encounter is that he gives us the whole panoramic view and all the relations in between, all the stages and steps of the journey. And unless, of course, there is no other way except to walk, and after a long time one begins to see that what applies at one stage does not apply at another. That's why we have some of his Mahavakyas. Reason was the helper, reason is the bar. When we have passed beyond knowings, then we have wisdom. Reason was the helper, reason is the bar. When we have passed beyond enjoyings, then we shall have delight. Desire was the helper, desire is the bar. When we have passed beyond individualizing, then we shall be the true individual. Ego was the helper, ego is the bar. By and large, couple of words here and there maybe. The thing is that we were speaking last time about how nature has invested so much effort in the creation of the ego. And why does it do it if at the end we are asked to abolish the ego, demolish the ego? This is something very interesting. This principle of stages is always to be respected in human life. In the Gita it is very simple, because Gita, Shri Krishna, puts a mathni, what do you call it, with which you churn the Kshir Sagar, the ocean of knowledge. He puts a huge for churning, and he churns and takes the butter out. Right from childhood he had this habit of taking butter and feeding to everybody. So he takes the essence of that Kshir Sagar, the ocean of milk, at the heart of which lies infinite time, and in the heart of infinite time is seated the great Lord. So he does that and gives us the butter. So it's easy, we have no choice, we eat the butter, and we know how steps and stages are there. If we read the Gita, we clearly see the steps and stages. The same Gita speaks of, at its highest, the greatest secret, Sarva Dharman Parityajya Mamekam Sharanam Vraja. Abandon all dharmas and take refuge in me alone. The same Gita also speaks about Chaturvarnya. The same Gita speaks about Swabhava and Swadharma, bidding Arjuna to rise and slay, because that is his Swadharma, to fight for what is true, what is just, what is right. If prematurely Arjuna abandons and says Sarva Dharman Parityajya Mamekam Sharanam Vraja, then he would walk away like Vidur from the battlefield and say it's none of my business, which is precisely what Arjuna wants to do. So this whole evolutionary journey of man, the Gita gives in a nutshell. But Sri Aurobindo is not content with giving us only butter. So he gives us the whole Shir Sagar. Now we have to choose whether we want to take butter, we want to take curd out of it, whether we want to turn it into cottage cheese and make some nice dishes, or we want to drink the milk as it is. And when it goes inside, it nourishes us, rejuvenates us, gives us the right knowledge, the right intuition, the right impulse, the right feeling. So this is the entire panorama which he opens before us. And while at one stage, at the highest stage, if one wants to take a leap from merely being a human to enter into the vaster fields of spiritual self-knowledge and self-existent delight, when we want to step out of the limited cabin of our heart, which throbs and flutters with hopes and wants and love and grief and hate, to a divine love and a greater ananda, we must get rid of this ego like a useless garment. That is how Sri Aurobindo says. We must cast it aside like a useless garment. Its purpose is over. And yet, if we are not ready for that, if we are still belonging to a mass of humanity moved by all kinds of ideas and impulses, then ego becomes a helper. And we can have a very simple image, just as if when a person enters into a plot to construct a house, so the first thing is he gets the plot registered in his name. The next step is he has to build, so a blueprint comes. Now as he starts building the great mansion for his ego self, so he starts with putting some scaffolding of bamboos. And the bamboos are placed in a way that the building must come up. And the greater the building, the more the bamboos and the bigger the scaffolding. And when the building is ready, then he must pull down the same bamboos which have been built with so much care, so much time and energy and money has gone into building the bamboos. And when the building is ready, the bamboos must go. It will be very odd and ugly to keep the bamboos aside simply because so much labor has gone into it. So nature invests a lot of labor in creating the individual, ego. And this is something unique to human beings. Of course, the ego sense starts stirring in an animal, Sri Aurobindo tells us, but it develops only with the development of the mind, with the mental personality. Before that, one is still a mass. And how nature begins to develop it and why it begins to develop it? Precisely because the universal and the subconscient. First, so that the subconscient can become conscious in us. So when we make an offering, we make a conscious offering of the shadows. And second, or more importantly, the universal can exceed beyond itself. If we didn't have the ego, we will depend upon the entire human mass to arise. Just as the animal, poor animal depend, there is nothing like an individual baboon turning into a human being. A whole set of baboons must evolve. Otherwise, there is no possibility. But in human beings, there is a possibility that an individual, in fact, it's not a possibility, it's a reality that the individual is actually always ahead of the mass. And this, even an individual ego, now here, Sri Aurobindo makes a distinction between ego and egoism that we are all aware. Egoism is the crude reflection of the ego sense. Ego sense is the sense of separativeness. I am different, I am separate, I am unique. Essentially, in reality, it's not true because essentially it's all one movement of a vast nature carrying everything forward. And each thing is nothing but in its totality, an aspect or power or energy of the divine, always held in his lap, let loose forth into the act of creation. There is a beautiful word in the Gita, Visargaha. I let loose forth, that is the original karma. So this is the real truth, but in reality we cannot live in that consciousness. If we start living in that consciousness, we will end up with chaos. Everything is divine, this is a great truth. But as we know that when Paramahansa gave this truth and the disciple misapplied it. He was going on the road and an elephant was coming in front of him. And he had just learned the lesson that everything is Brahman. Sarva Khalvidam Brahman. It's the highest truth ever uttered. But he turned it into a mental formula. This is what happens when we don't have the living experience and turn it into a mental formula. So he is going and the elephant is coming and he says, the Mahavat seated on the elephant sees this man right in front. So he says, get aside, get aside. He says, you don't know, you are an ignorant man. You are a fool. You should attend the classes of my great master who has taught me that all is divine, all is Brahman. Mahavat says, I don't know, you are very qualified, I understand, you are a great being, but I know this much about the nature of the elephant. If he sees anything in front of his way, he is going to just kick it aside. No, you don't know. You are an ignorant person. You should study the Shastra. All is Brahman. And before he could finish the sentence, the elephant does come and throws him aside into the Nalla. All battered and bruised, he goes back and still says to the master, what kind of a knowledge you have given me? So he says, I gave you the perfect knowledge, but you misapplied it. So there is a truth of knowledge and there is a misapplication of it in practice. Again, because of the different stages of our journey and different forms of manifestation. So he says, I told you perfectly that all is Brahman. But you didn't listen the two words which are crucial. All is Brahman in a sense. So, in manifestation, the Brahman manifests itself in differential terms. You should have listened to the Mahavat Brahman who was telling you to step aside. So, this is the question of stages and steps of the great ascent. How does human journey begins? It begins, Aurobindo says, first with the desired self. It's not the individuality. Very often when we speak of individuality and ego, we think the desired self. But desired self is no individuality at all. This individuality that I do what I like is actually not individuality at all, but being moved by desired self. It is the most primitive stage of human development. When one is moved and jostled by desires carrying to this shop and that shop, it's a perfect example of a person who enters into a bazaar. He has entered without thinking even of buying. But 1 hour is spent going from one shop to another without knowing what one wants to buy actually. And this is the kind of jostling by the desired self. And to bring some kind of order into this desired self, of a desire-driven human animal, there comes another layer of humanity, governed by the social rule, the external Shastra. So humanity which is living in the desired self needs the external Shastra. It needs social conventions, modes, and one is told that the individual must immolate at the altar of society. Why? Because he is not yet ready for the greater maturity. So such an individual, the mass, when we are yet subject to the mass, to the subconscious habits, so to create some kind of an order, there come social rules, social norms, social modes. And then when we are stuck to that, then out of that social sense arises the revolting individual. He says, I am not going to believe just because society says so. I want to question everything. Aurobindo speaks about the brain of India, in that he says that how are we to recover the original thinking that we have lost? He says, for a moment, by reversing the process by which we lost it. So what is the process? For some time we must question everything. So this is the stage when the ego is beginning to arise out of the social type. And one questions and decides, this I accept, this I don't. It is the first stage of the formation of ego, not the mature ego, first stage. When we question everything, we question our own existence, we question the world around us, we question the nature of everything, we question God, forget about parents, they are the poor, least important human beings on earth. So we also question parents. So in the first stages of the ego formation, human beings question everything. And if they don't question, they are not going to develop into an ego individuality. They will only remain puppets in the hand of society. Whatever society says, they do it faithfully and reproduce mechanically like robots. Now, so long as nature is satisfied with that, it's fine. But when nature wants to quicken and accelerate the impulse, then the individual begins to question the external Shastra. Whatever rule of living has been given to it, it doesn't accept on the basis of tradition. When we look at life from this angle, then we discover, oh my God, acceleration of evolution is taking place. But when we look only from our fixed angle, then we say, oh, where is the supramental evolution? Today's children are revolting, they have no values. It's true, but they must discover their own inner value system. So in the formation of ego, through the process of questioning, we pick up certain aspects of nature, certain movements, certain ideas as our own and identify with it, and we say, this is me and this is not me. Now in that process, because the mind is very limited, when it forms the ego identity, it picks up one or two or three idea out of a pool of infinity. So somebody picks up, let us say, the idea of truth and justice, and he starts organizing his whole life around that. He becomes an activist. He becomes a crusader for that. Somebody picks up the idea of love and peace, and he becomes a crusader for love and peace. And he cannot reconcile the two. And when we are living by that, the big problem of living in the ego identity is, number one, we have an innocent need that everybody should think like us. So if I am peace-loving, everybody should be peace-loving. If somebody is not peace-loving, we feel, oh, this is not right. We are very uncomfortable. So we either shut ourselves in a cocoon or declare that is not good, that is not right. But we don't realize that peace and strength are two arms of the one deity. Love and wisdom are reconciled in the breast of the one. There is a beautiful line of Aurobindo. Of course, every line is beautiful from his poem Who. He slays without stint and is full of compassion. He wars for the world and its ultimate years. So Krishna is speaking of Krishna, who, the being who is hidden in this universe, in the depths of darkness, full of love, full of ananda, full of compassion, can slay without stint, can engage himself into the fiercest of battles. But that is that stage. At our stage, we have a need to pick up one idea out of rest, and we declare other things are not self. And even the divine we see is erected in that one idea. And we do it all the time. Even in Aurobindo's yoga, mother is this, mother is that. And mother says in one of the places, when people do this, saying mother did this, mother did that, mother said this, mother said that, they add one more stupidity to another. Because she is saying this in a certain context. The context is when somebody speaks of social norms, and there is somebody who is not living according to social norms. And she says, this lady was suddenly shunned by everybody because she was not living according to accepted social norms. So mother says, those who still think along those lines are not yet ready to enter into the path of yoga. And this is so true, because one is still carried by mass ideas. So one must have one's own ideas, opinions about things. It doesn't matter. They are all ideas and opinions of ignorance. They are all one-sided angles of looking at infinity. Man cannot help but look at life like that. But that is a stage of development. And walking through that imperfect staff, he reaches a point where one idea clashes with another, and he must reconcile. And this is nature's very dreadful strategy, but a very charming strategy. That when nature wants us to evolve, he puts two people together who think very differently. When it doesn't want you to evolve, then it puts two very like-minded people together. So you are happy. But when nature wants you to evolve, it will put two people who feel very differently together. Now, instead of fighting and quarreling, we must take it as a challenge. This is really a challenge. How can two opposing things be reconciled in our nature? There is no other way. One can live together unless one reconciles. So one is very peace-loving, the other is, Mahakali incarnate. One is, full of wisdom, the other is full of strength. And they must come together, because this is the beauty of nature. It actually is an acceleration of the process. So every time we have one kind of ego identity, nature smashes at it when we must evolve further. And it does it through creating circumstances. So every time we have a crisis, every time we have a difficulty, actually it is grace. The mother says, people love that side of grace which gives peace. But there is another side of grace which helps us to progress. And that's why one can see why of all the gods, the mother said below Shiva, the Lord of transformation. It's very interesting. When we read Aurobindo's poem, Epiphany. So here he describes two aspects of Shiva. One aspect of Shiva is where he is benevolent, Ashutosh, freely is giving generously. Anybody, Bhoot, Pret, Pishach, Gandharv, Sur, Nar, whether you are a god or you are a demon, whether you are a saintly being or you are a most crooked being, Shiva accepts everybody in his fold. And he gives generously. It doesn't matter. He gives all kinds of boons which Krishna has to later on handle. He is known for that. He'll give a boon to Jarasandh that one day nobody can beat you. Now it's, difficult. And that Jarasandh on a particular day will sit and he says, now this is the challenge. So Krishna has to find ways and means how to, because he has to preserve the creation and carry it forward. So Shiva on one side is Ashutosh, the giver of all boons. On the other side, there is a side of Shiva which is threatening even to the gods. And when he reveals that side, the Rudra, the destroyer of all things, then even the gods are terrified by his shaking of the spear, and they take shelter and take refuge. They say, bring that benevolent form. The same thing we see in the Gita, in the great battlefield, where on one side Krishna says, when Arjuna says, who are you? He says, me? I am Kalosmi Bhava. I am Time the Destroyer. What are you doing here? You are a god. I have come to destroy all these peoples. Loka Shekrat Pravratto. Even Arjuna is shaken to the core. He says, I don't want this. Show me your beneficent form. Something which is, a god who is pleasing to the eyes. This is too great a godhead. So similarly, when in our journey we move from one ego stage to another ego stage, from the cruder ego to the more refined ego, to the yet more refined ego, to the more refined ego, to the subtler ego. We move from the gross tamasic ego of the crude physical type to the more refined, not refined, but half crude, half refined, rajasic ego of the kinetic man driven by action and energy, whose life is like an action film. Then we move from that to a more sattvic ego. And it is this sattvic ego of whom it is said that it begins to reach a point where it is ready to seek the divine. That is the moment when the transition base is clear. Why? Because it begins to feel imprisoned. It's Shastra. Sattvic man is governed by a certain right sense of things. He wants to do the right thing. He is the person who is in conflict inside. Is this right? Is this true? Is this noble? Is this beautiful? Is this chivalrous? Is this worthy of me? And yet he finds no answer. As long as he finds the answers, he is not ready. And this again we see in the Gita. Yudhishthir is not fit for the Gita. Why? Because he is happy with his Shastra. Yudhishthir his ego typifies the sattvic ego. I must always be truthful and honest in my dealing. That's his yardstick. On that yardstick, he sees the battle is justified. This battle is a just and right battle. That's all. But Arjuna goes into a conflict. He says, yes, it's a just battle. But what happens when I fight? Everything will be destroyed. I'll become the destroyer of these people. I'll be responsible for all this pain and misery and suffering. So he goes into an internal conflict, and all his inner idealism doesn't help him. His sattvic ego is perplexed. Should I do this? Should I do that? And that is the point when he does a gesture, which is what the ego must do if it must go further. He does what Yudhishthir doesn't do. He does what even Bhishma doesn't do. He does what Vidura doesn't do. He says, I don't understand a thing about anything. O Keshav, Shishyasteham sadhimam. I surrender myself to you. Lead me on this great battle of life. So, what are these signs when the ego is ready for this departure? But before that, this point that we are saying, that how for different stages there are different principles to be applied. Sri Aurobindo writes this beautifully, a short passage before we come to those signs. Sri Aurobindo is speaking here about the sacrifice. In spiritual life, we are called upon to do sacrifice. And usually by sacrifice, one thinks self-mortification, putting oneself in all kinds of odd situations and odd positions, discomfort, etc., etc. Whereas true sense of sacrifice in Sri Aurobindo's light and Sri Krishna's light is to evolve through beauty, through the sense of the beautiful. It's not self-mortification but self-refinement. We choose the more refined and discard the crude and the ugly. So Sri Aurobindo is telling us this profounder idea of the worldwide law is at the heart of the teaching about works given in the Gita. A spiritual union with the highest by sacrifice, a sacrifice of the lower for the higher. An unreserved self-giving to the eternal is the core of its doctrine. The vulgar conception of sacrifice is an act of painful self-immolation, austere self-mortification, difficult self-effacement. Now, this is what we normally understand when we talk of going beyond the ego. That we must mortify ourselves, we must give ourselves pain, we must suffer. Now, this is the vulgar conception. This is not the royal road. So he says this is the common idea, and in fact he says this vulgar conception. This kind of sacrifice may go even as far as self-mutilation and self-torture. So if there is a fan, I must switch off the fan because fan gives me comfort. This is going too far. It's good enough if we don't need the AC and we are fine with the fan. So I must live with only one pair of clothes. I must sleep on the floor. Why? Because ego must go. I must sleep with a brick under my head. This is a vulgar conception of self-sacrifice. And yet, look what Sri Aurobindo tells us. These things may be temporarily necessary in man's hard endeavor to exceed the natural self. And yet he says even these things may be necessary. But when he tells us that if the egoism in his nature is violent and obstinate, if it has to be met sometimes by an answering strong internal repression and counterbalancing violence. If we have too crude an ego, sometimes we have to tell someone, tie my hands, let me not do this. It's necessary sometimes even to do that. When the egoism, in some parts of nature, it doesn't mean the whole constitution is so crude. If the whole constitution is so crude, one cannot think of moving towards the divine. But some parts of a nature may be very crude. And those parts sometimes, for some period, may be necessary to be denied. There is that famous answer of Sri Aurobindo when someone wrote a letter to Sri Aurobindo that I have this strong desire to eat this. And Sri Aurobindo writes back, eat your desire. Now this of course is too much for many of us to swallow. There is a very interesting little story that, there used to be people who would make something and send to Sri Aurobindo, and Sri Aurobindo would taste it and send the rest back. So people got a brilliant idea. In the name of Sri Aurobindo, we can make very nice things and dishes. Sri Aurobindo will have only one bite and send back the things. So there were a group of people, 3 persons, who wanted to make jackfruit vegetable. So first they went and stole jackfruits from, one of the gardens. Now stealing is justified because, it is going to Sri Aurobindo. They made a vegetable and they made puri and they made halwa and, they sent a whole dibba full, to Sri Aurobindo. So the entire thing goes to Sri Aurobindo and they're eagerly waiting now the prasad will come back. For a change, nothing came back. The dibba came back empty. So, when people tried to investigate into the matter, because Sri Aurobindo cannot eat so much, so Sri Aurobindo took a bite, a little bit, and he distributed to all the people who were there around him. And naturally it was too tasty to be resisted. And what came back was khali dabbas. So sometimes the divine uses even these methods. That no, this part of nature needs to be met with a counterbalancing violence. So on one side, this is not the principle of sacrifice, yet sometimes that may be required in some stage. These things may be temporarily necessary. But the Gita discourages any excess of violence done to oneself. For the self within is really the Godhead evolving. The beautiful. It's not by violence that the ego has to be destroyed. It's not by that kind of sacrificing it at the altar of other egos. It is not to become football in the hands of others. That whatever others say, I must, because ego has to go. By doing this, we actually end up encouraging the collective ego and the egoism of others. So it's all right in the world play that egos meet egos. Sometimes it's good to tell the other person, hold on, that's enough. So here Aurobindo is telling us, it is not to be done. Discourage any excess of violence done to oneself. For the self within is really the Godhead evolving. It is Krishna. It is the divine. It has not to be troubled and tortured as the titans of the world trouble and torture it, but to be increasingly fostered, cherished, luminously exposed to a divine light and strength and joy and wideness. What is the way for the ego to go? By constantly opening it and exposing it to the light, by putting there the light, the wisdom. Not by indulging in it. Oh, acha, we are not supposed to be violent to the ego, so let me indulge. Not by indulgence, not by violence, but to constantly expose it to the light and the wisdom. This is the path. We'll speak about it more, but right now we end with what Mother speaks about the readiness. How do we know? This was actually a question someone raised. How do we know that the ego is ready to be dropped? The Gita also speaks about it. The Gita speaks about the conditions of the spiritual seeker. Amazing similarities we find, naturally, because the conditions are the same. What Shri Krishna said in that age, Aurobindo upgrades it much further and gives it today. So someone has asked this question. This is from volume 4, page 97 to 103. I'll read from bits and parts. Someone has asked the mother, are there any signs which indicate that one is ready for the path? Especially if one has no spiritual teacher. So it's very relevant in today's context. How do we know that a person is ready or not ready? It's not a mass movement. Sri Aurobindo's yoga is not like that. One has to be ready. It's not like tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people have turned and all kinds of people. It's not that. So mother says, yes. The most important indication is a perfect equality of soul in all circumstances. Now it's very interesting. How does this equality come? How does this indicate? Precisely because nothing else matters to us. When nothing else matters to us except the divine, there is a beautiful line in Savitri indicating this state. Its absence made the greatest actions dull. Its presence made the smallest seem divine. So one begins to have the tadap, the feeling, the wish, the aspiration. I want that. Then nothing else really matters. What matters a lot to others spontaneously stops mattering because something else has begun to matter. So mother is saying circumstances no more affect us. So coming to ashram is a very good indication that one is ready or not. If it matters, then one is not ready. If one is beginning to look for cozy circumstances, when one is comfortable, everybody is very pleasant natured, everybody says nice and good things, we are not yet ready. Because circumstances shouldn't matter. It is an absolutely indispensable basis. Not the quietness that comes from inertia. Even people who are asleep, nothing matters. But the sensation of a concentrated power which keeps you always steady whatever happens, even in circumstances which may appear to you the most terrible in your life. A second sign, now this is important, you feel completely imprisoned in your ordinary normal consciousness. So as long as we are happy the way we are, we should be happy the way we are. As simple as that. Nature will carry us. It has its own ways and means. And it has its standard way and mean. First, it teaches us in the right way. When it doesn't, it gives us blows. Mother speaks about it in one of her later talks. She says that, well, obviously she is Jagan Mata, she wants to give everything to her children. She says, but I have found that humanity has become complacent. Of course, in-house crowd, so we can say, and it's there in the collected works. She speaks actually about the ashram, so it's relevant to all of us. She says that, everything is provided, so aspiration is replaced by complacency, because everything is provided. And then she says, that means humanity is not yet ready. It needs blows. These are her own words. So the other way is when we are not ready, when she gives us lovingly, makes nice food and gives us, we are very fussy. No, this is not very nice. I want something better. At one point of time when people were approaching, in ashram, 2 days Gujarati dishes were prepared, 2 days Bengali dishes, 2 days something else. So people started fighting that every day, that kind should be prepared, and today the salt was not good, tomorrow, other day the spice was not good. So Sri Aurobindo said, now onwards, everybody should get rid of this and prepare something which everybody likes and dislikes, whatever it is. Every day there will be a standard menu. Because otherwise we started demanding beautiful things every day. So the mother says the second is that the ordinary consciousness no more attracts us. It is, we feel as in something extremely hard, something suffocating and intolerable. This is the true Vairagya. Not because we are afraid of life, not because we have failed in life, but because we don't find it any longer pleasant. Even if we are living in a palace with everything at our disposal. And that, I suppose, is the story of Nachiketa. He's asked, if you are given all these things, he says, what will I do with this? All of them have a term and an existence. I want that which is termless and that which is the supreme existence. As though you had to pierce a hole in a brass wall and the torture becomes almost unbearable. It is stifling. There is an inner effort to break through and you cannot manage to break through. What is the sign that the baby is ready to be born? When the baby is small, there is no discomfort. As the baby grows, the mother begins to first feel a little bit of leg kicking, then she is happy. Then after some time, there is the discomfort. After some time, there is pain, there is restlessness inside. One wants to come out. So the same thing applies here. When we are restless inside the ordinary consciousness, and that again is the second sign we see in humanity at large. It's restless beyond measure. It is looking for one hole through which it can come out. A couple of minutes more. It means that your inner consciousness has reached a point where its outer mold is much too small for it. The mold of ordinary life, of ordinary activities, ordinary relations, all that becomes so small, so petty, you feel within a force to break all that. When somebody wrote to Sri Aurobindo that, I don't feel any interest in family and relations nowadays. Sri Aurobindo says it's a release. Family relations are based on tamasic affiliations. The Gita describes it as one of these signs of this readiness for the spiritual path. It speaks of equality, it speaks of love for solitude and seeking of knowledge, and it also says the normal family life no more interests and attracts us. We may be living in it, but we are not yet belonging to it. There is yet another sign. When you concentrate and have an aspiration, you feel something coming down into you. You receive an answer. You feel a light, a peace, a force coming down, and almost immediately, you need not wait or spend a very long time. Nothing but an inner aspiration, a call, and the answer comes. So this is the state. These are the three signs. She has given a couple of more which we shall read next time and go further on the journey. But three signs is an equality, in the face of adverse circumstances. It's not the deepest spiritual equanimity, but at least in the face of circumstances, physical, vital, mental, one is able to bear them. So this is one. Second is ordinary consciousness becomes suffocating. We are not comfortable and happy in it anymore. And the third is that when we concentrate, we feel some kind of a contact and an answer. So we will pause here.